The burlap sack trembled in Sarah's weathered hands like a living thing fighting to escape. Blood had seeped through the coarse weave, staining her calloused fingers crimson in the dying light of another merciless Texas evening. Across the dusty yard, Tom McKinnon stood frozen beside his horse, his shadow stretching long toward the barn where 17 years of silence had finally broken. "Please don't turn away," she whispered, her voice cracking like drought-parched earth. Tom's boots hadn't moved since she'd emerged from the house carrying her burden. The same boots that had walked away from this place in 1859, leaving behind a wife he thought he knew and promises he believed were carved in stone. Now, in 1876, those boots felt rooted to soil that had drunk too much sorrow. The McKinnon Ranch sprawled before them, 1,500 acres of scrub brush and stubborn cattle, built on the bones of dreams that had withered under an unforgiving sun. Tom had returned 3 days ago to sell what remained: the land, the livestock, the ghosts. Sarah had been waiting on the porch as if she'd known he would come, her gray hair loose around shoulders that had carried secrets too heavy for one woman to bear alone. 17 years, Tom had said when he'd climbed down from his horse, dust settling around them like the weight of abandoned time. 17 years, she'd echoed, but her eyes had held something deeper than regret. Now the sack in her hands told a story that words had failed to carry across nearly 2 decades of silence. Tom's throat worked against sounds that wouldn't come, his weathered face carved deeper by shadows that had nothing to do with the setting sun. The evening wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that made his horse sidestep nervously. Sarah took one step closer, then another, the sack's contents shifting with the sound that raised the hair on Tom's neck. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed earth, but each step seemed to echo in the hollow spaces between his ribs. "You have to understand," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to moan through the eaves of the house they'd once shared. "I never meant for you to find out this way." Tom's hand moved instinctively toward the Colt at his hip, then stopped. Some truths, he realized, couldn't be shot down or ridden away from. Some truths had teeth that would follow a man to his grave. The sack swayed in Sarah's grip, and something inside shifted again, something that made Tom's blood run cold. Tom's fingers trembled as they hovered near the sack's twisted opening. The late sun caught the silver of his wedding band, the one he never removed despite 17 years of believing Sarah had betrayed everything they'd built together. Now that certainty crumbled like adobe in a flash flood. "Before you look," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "You need to know about the night you left." The night. Tom's jaw clenched at the memory that had poisoned every sunrise since. He'd found her in the barn with Marcus Donovan, the circuit judge's son, her dress disheveled and guilt written across her face like a brand. No words had been exchanged. Tom had simply saddled his horse and ridden into a darkness that had lasted 17 years. "I was screaming," Sarah continued, her knuckles white around the sack's neck. "But you were already gone." Something cold crawled up Tom's spine. The horse whinnied nervously behind him, sensing the shift in the air that came before storms, or revelations that changed the shape of a man's world. "Sarah," he started, but she shook her head. "Marcus didn't stop when I said no." The words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through Tom's carefully constructed certainty. "And when I found out 3 months later that I was carrying—" She lifted the sack slightly, and Tom heard that shifting sound again, softer now, like whispered secrets. Tom's knees nearly buckled. 17 years of hatred began to crack along fault lines he thought were solid as bedrock. The child would have been born in spring of 1860. Would have had Sarah's dark eyes and his stubborn chin. Would have learned to ride before walking, just as Tom had planned during those long nights when he dreamed of the future they'd build together. "Where?" Tom's voice came out as gravel and dust. "Stillborn." Sarah's voice broke on the word. 3 days old. "I buried him behind the oak tree, where we used to watch the sunset." The sack seemed heavier in her hands now, and Tom understood with a clarity that made his chest tight. Not it. Him. Their son, or the son that should have been theirs, wrapped in burlap like a shameful secret because Tom hadn't been there to build a proper coffin or dig a proper grave or hold his wife when the world ended in their bedroom. "I've been moving him," Sarah whispered. "Every few years, when the coyotes get too close or the rains wash the dirt away. He's been waiting for you to come home." Tom looked at his wife, truly looked at her for the first time since his return. The gray in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the way she held herself like a woman who'd carried grief so long it had become part of her skeleton. His hand reached toward the sack, then stopped. Some thresholds, once crossed, led to countries from which no man returned unchanged. The distant thunder of hoofbeats cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. Tom's head snapped toward the horizon where dust rose against the purple sky, and his blood turned to ice water in his veins. 8 riders, maybe 10, moving fast and purposeful across the scrubland toward the ranch. "Sarah, get inside." Tom's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent 17 years learning to read danger in the set of a stranger's shoulders, the way sunlight caught steel. But Sarah didn't move. Her grip on the sack tightened, and her eyes held a resignation that spoke of battles fought and lost in the quiet years after Tom had ridden away. "They've been coming every few months," she said, her voice flat as hammered tin. "Ever since Marcus became judge." The name hit Tom like a fist to the gut. Marcus Donovan. The circuit judge's son who'd grown up to wear his father's robes and wield power like a weapon. The man who'd destroyed Tom's marriage and now, it seemed, had come to finish what he'd started. "What does he want?" Tom asked, though part of him already knew. Men like Marcus didn't forget the women who'd fought them, didn't forgive the secrets that could destroy their carefully built reputations. "The land," Sarah said simply. "And my silence." The riders were close enough now that Tom could make out individuals. Marcus in the lead on a blood-bay stallion, his black coat pristine despite the dust, his face set in the same arrogant lines Tom remembered from their youth. Behind him rode his men, the kind of hired guns who asked no questions and left no witnesses. Tom's hand found the grip of his Colt, muscle memory from 17 years of living by his gun in places where the law was whatever the fastest draw decided it should be. But 8 against 1 were odds that even the best gunfighter couldn't face and expect to see another sunrise. "There's still time," Sarah said, reading his thoughts. "You can ride out the back, follow the creek bed. They won't pursue you far." "And leave you here?" Tom's laugh held no humor. "To face them alone with." He looked at the sack in her hands, understanding now why she'd waited for him to return. Some burials required both parents present. Some truths needed witnesses who shared the weight of loss. The riders were 100 yards out now, close enough for Tom to see the satisfied smile on Marcus's face. The man had grown soft around the middle, his hair silver at the temples, but his eyes held the same cold calculation Tom remembered. Power had refined his cruelty, made it respectable. "He knows you're here," Sarah said. "Saw your horse from the road." Tom nodded, his mind racing through possibilities that all ended in blood. The barn was too far. The house offered cover but no escape. The old well might provide concealment, but it would trap them like rabbits in a burrow. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Sarah took a step closer to Tom, close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair and see the way 17 years of solitude had worn her down to bone and sinew and stubborn will. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "he's our son, not his." Tom looked down at the sack between them, at the small weight that represented everything they'd lost and everything they'd never had the chance to become. Then he looked at his wife, not Marcus's victim, and made a choice that would define whatever moments remained to them. "Then we bury him together," Tom said, his voice carrying across the yard like a prayer or a promise. The riders were 50 yards out now, and closing fast. Marcus reined in his stallion 20 feet from where Tom and Sarah stood, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid the spray of blood when the inevitable shooting started. His men fanned out in a practiced semicircle, hands resting easy on their gun butts, eyes cold as winter stars. "Tom McKinnon," Marcus said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man accustomed to having his words treated as law. "Heard you'd come crawling back. Tom didn't respond. His left hand moved slowly to cover Sarah's where she gripped the sack, and he felt her fingers relax slightly at his touch. 17 years of silence had taught them both that some conversations were held without words. "Sarah, darling," Marcus continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for affection by a man who never heard a snake speak. "You've been avoiding my visits. That's not neighborly." "I have nothing you want," Sarah said, but her voice carried none of the conviction her words implied. Marcus's laugh was polished silver over rusted iron. "Oh, but you do. You have stories, Sarah. Stories about things that happened a long time ago. Stories that might damage a man's reputation if they were told in the wrong places." Tom felt Sarah's hand tremble beneath his. Around them, the evening air had grown still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Even the cattle in the distant pasture had stopped their lowing, sensing the tension that crackled between the two men like heat lightning. "And now," Marcus continued, his gaze moving to Tom, "you have a witness. Someone who might be inclined to believe those stories and spread them around." One of Marcus's men shifted in his saddle, and Tom caught the movement in his peripheral vision. The mathematics of gunfighting played out in his mind: draw times, angles of fire, the way shadows fell across faces and made targets harder to find. 8 guns against 1. Possible, but only if he was willing to let Sarah die in the crossfire. "What do you want, Marcus?" Tom asked, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in places where words were measured in grains of powder and ounces of lead. "I want what I've always wanted," Marcus replied. "Respect. Obedience. Silence." His eyes moved to the sack in Sarah's hands. "And I want to know what she's been digging up behind that oak tree." Sarah's breath caught, and Tom felt something shift in the air between them. Marcus had been watching, waiting, gathering information like a spider at the center of a web that stretched across 17 years of careful planning. "Nothing that concerns you," Tom said. "Everything on this land concerns me," Marcus replied. "I hold the mortgage. I hold the note. And soon I'll hold the deed." He smiled, and Tom saw in that expression the same arrogance that had destroyed his marriage and driven him into the wilderness. "Unless, of course, you'd like to make other arrangements." Tom looked at Sarah, at the way the dying light caught the silver in her hair and the stubborn set of her jaw. She'd been fighting this battle alone for 17 years, carrying secrets and sorrows that would have broken a weaker woman. Now, finally, she wouldn't have to face it alone. "What kind of arrangements?" Tom asked, though he already knew the answer. Marcus's smile widened. "The kind that end with you riding away again, and Sarah finally accepting that some women are meant to be owned." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Tom felt something inside him settle into the cold, quiet place where decisions were made and lives were measured in heartbeats. Around them, the desert waited. Tom's hand moved to his gun with the fluid certainty of a man who'd made peace with dying. But Sarah's fingers closed over his wrist, stopping him with a touch that carried 17 years of regret and a love that had survived longer than either of them had thought possible. "No," she said quietly. "Not like this." She stepped forward, and Tom watched his wife, walk toward the men who'd haunted her nights for nearly 2 decades. The sack in her hands seemed to grow lighter with each step, as if the burden she'd carried alone was finally finding shoulders strong enough to share its weight. "You want to know what I've been protecting?" Sarah's voice carried across the dusty yard with a clarity that made Marcus's hired guns shift nervously in their saddles. "You want to see what your violence created?" She loosened the sack's neck, and Tom held his breath as she reached inside. What emerged wasn't the small bones he'd expected, but something else entirely: a wooden cross, carved by inexperienced hands and weathered by years of Texas wind and rain. Below it, wrapped in a child's blanket that had once been white, lay the truth that had destroyed 3 lives and shaped 17 years of exile. "His name was Thomas," Sarah said, her voice steady now, carrying the authority of a woman who'd buried her child alone and tended his grave through seasons of drought and plenty. "He lived 3 days. Long enough to open his eyes. Long enough to know his mother's touch." Marcus's face had gone pale beneath his tan. Around him, his men looked anywhere but at the small bundle in Sarah's arms, suddenly uncomfortable with their role in this particular drama. You made me choose, Sarah continued, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since he'd arrived. Between my child's memory and my life. Between truth and survival. She smiled, and Tom saw in that expression the woman he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, fierce, unbroken, beautiful in her defiance. I chose truth. Tom stepped up beside his wife, his hand finding her shoulder, as she cradled their son for the first time in 17 years. The weight of regret settled around him like dust after a long ride, but beneath it was something else, something that felt like forgiveness, offered and received in equal measure. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What arguments could stand against a mother holding her dead child? What threats carried weight against people who'd already lost everything that mattered? One by one, his men reined their horses around and rode away, unwilling to be part of whatever came next. Even hired guns had lines they wouldn't cross, and some truths were too heavy for any man's conscience to bear. Finally, Marcus was alone, his stallion prancing nervously beneath him as the desert wind picked up and scattered dust across the yard like ash from old fires. This isn't over, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Yes, Sarah replied, looking down at the cross in her hands. It is. Tom watched Marcus ride away, becoming a dark speck against the purple sky before disappearing entirely. Then he looked at his wife, at the son he'd never known, at the small grave they would dig together behind the oak tree where they'd once planned their future. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of rain from distant mountains and the promise of morning beyond the darkness. Tom took the shovel from where it leaned against the porch and followed Sarah toward the tree where 17 years of silence would finally learn to speak. Behind them, the ranch house stood empty and patient, waiting for whatever came next. The last light faded, and the stars began their eternal watch over the Texas sky.